Welcome to 80 More Things, where we go beyond making a murderer and discuss questionable details of the Teresa Halbach murder case. My name is Fen. You can find me on Twitter at FenMN. Just a reminder that if you haven't watched the Netflix series Making a Murderer, stop listening to this podcast right now and go watch both seasons before joining us here, or you won't really understand much of what we are talking about. As always, I'm joined here by my co-host Julie, aka Pom Pom. She is Juju Pom Pom on Twitter, so you can follow her there. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Fen.
Here we are in season 2 of 80 More Things.
Yay!
And we've already had so many great guests, and there are many more to come, including today's. So one of the places I go for information about this case is to a subreddit called TikTok Manitowoc, which has been mentioned several times on this podcast. One of the major contributors on that subreddit is a poster who goes by the name of Henbury. He is also on Twitter. His handle there is @Henbury AV, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. One of the most popular Henbury posts is called the Know Your RAV series, which is where he delves deeply into issues surrounding Teresa's 1999 Toyota RAV4, which is, we all know, Sam William Henry 582, which was allegedly found on the Avery Salvage Yard on November 5th, 2005, by Pam and Nicole Sturm. Henbury is here to talk about that, and maybe some other things too. Welcome to 80 More Things, Henbury.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
We're super happy to have you here.
Can I try
So
that?
excited.
So, Henbury, there has been much speculation over the years about whether the RAV found by the Sturms was actually Teresa's RAV, and whether the RAV in custody of the state is the same RAV. Some people believe there were 2 RAVs. Some believe there were even more than that, multiple RAVs all over the place. Part of the problem stemmed from the fact that the RAV is this odd color that in some light looks more bluish and in other light looks more greenish. But you looked into the RAV in great detail. What do you think about this multiple RAV theory?
I can understand where the multiple RAV theory comes from. A lot of the photographs, obviously, some appear blue, some appear green, and that's where it stems from. And I entertained that idea for a while myself. The photos of the RAV at the Wisconsin State Crime Lab are the ones that appear blue. And I think you reach a point where when you look at all the photos that are available, you either have to accept that, yes, there's some discrepancies in the colour and move on, or you get stuck spinning your wheels, going around and around, convincing yourself and trying to convince others that there's 2 different vehicles, 2 different coloured vehicles. And I can understand that in the early reports, when the missing persons report went out, there was some conflict as far as, were they looking for a dark blue RAV? Were they looking for a dark green RAV? That it certainly muddies the waters, but I think you reach a point where you have to accept, yes, some photos look different, and say to yourself, well, no, there's just one car, and you move beyond that. Once you accept that there's one car, you can then study more details about the car and what happened with it. It's certainly a lighting issue, I think, that confuses a lot of people.
I think it's hard because some people are really sure that there's more than one RAV. Like, they are convinced, absolutely convinced, and convincing them otherwise is very challenging sometimes. And I often call back to your Know Your RAV series to find the facts that you can give to them to prove.
Is something I noticed in looking at the photos myself, and this was before we got the most recent huge package of photos, is when you look at the photos of the RAV on the salvage yard, and then you compare those to the photos in the crime lab. On the driver's side of the RAV, there are mud splatters. And the mud splatters are in the same exact pattern on both cars. So color of the paint aside, to exactly duplicate those mud splatters, it would have to be like painted on with a template or something. Like, it's a stencil, it's not actual mud. That to me is what told me those are the same car, because that's not something that's, oh yeah, it's the same one and then all the mud's all different. It's exactly the same. That tells me right there, there's no question.
Yeah, and I think you'll find when Calumet went back and re-investigated in 2017, they were able to get those photos from Kelly Pitson from when she took that trip with Teresa. I think it was the summer before she went missing in October. And it looks like there's that same mud pattern on the side then as well. And that was what I tried to do with the first post about the RAV. I was able to obtain the specifications for the car from the Toyota website when you punch in the VIN. And the details that came out of that, the features of the car, they're all consistent across all photos. The sunroof, for the most part, the tyres, the damage at the front, it's all consistent across all the photos. And so that was what I was trying to achieve with that first post, was to demonstrate that it is only the one vehicle consistently.
You mentioned the damage to the front, and what you're talking about is the front driver's side has some damage. It's missing a blinker light. It's got some holes kind of poked into the bumper, and it looks like the inner lining of the wheel well was damaged in some way that caused it to fold up inside the wheel well. What do you make of that damage? Do you have any thoughts about where it might have come from, when, how?
I'm smiling right now because I don't know the answer to that. Wouldn't we all like to know? The damage you can see is present on the vehicle at the salvage yard in the stern photos. So it predates whenever those photos were taken, apparently the 5th of November. When I looked at those photos closely, there is some sort of red fragment in the plastic bumper, which would apparently be related to whatever that vehicle has hit or been hit by. And I know Kathleen Zellner has said, I think she said originally that it was possibly from a red post outside Stephen Overy's trailer. And then she said later in Making a Murderer that it was from bumping that red car that was blocking the conveyor road to the salvage yard. There's definitely a theme of red objects striking that vehicle. I've spent a lot of time trying to think about and find evidence of what that could have been, but I can't. It's beyond me. I haven't been able to figure that one out.
And according to the most recent photos taken, that red material is now missing. It's not there anymore.
Was missing. I actually have to post a correction. When one of the users on Reddit, Seeking Truth for Good, managed to get a hold of the Wisconsin State Patrol photos, and they were all originally digital and in nice high resolution. And I've since found the red fragment that I thought had been removed from that plastic bumper. If you play with the light settings on the close-ups of the RAV in the Calumet County Sheriff's car park, it is actually still in there. You can see it. That then brings it back a step. Where I thought it was missing, it should therefore still be embedded in the bumper. So if and when Kathleen Zellner gets access to that vehicle, they should be able to find that and get it out and test it, see what it is. I've speculated that it could be a paint chip from a car. If it is, then they should be able to trace that, and they can narrow down or, perhaps figure out what has hit that car. I think everybody agrees it was something red.
Indeed.
There's one color everybody can agree on for once.
Yeah.
Don't start.
So usually when we do one of these episodes, we talk about one of the days of the 80 Days of 80 More Things. So the one that I want to talk about is actually, I kind of think of it as your day, and it is day number 2. And day number 2 says, the RAV key was immediately tagged as belonging to, quote, victim, even though it was found on a salvage yard with hundreds of auto keys everywhere. So they found this key. They immediately tagged it as belonging to victim. There's some differing testimony regarding this key.
Typos. They're all typos.
They sure do have a lot of typos.
They do.
So it started out the key was found on the 7th, and then they changed it over time to the key being found on the 8th. Why do you think they did that?
So the key or keys is something I've spent probably too long trying to figure out. They had a key at least by the 7th. And we know that because in Fassbender's report, he spoke to, I think it was Groffey, on the 7th of November, which was the Monday. And he documented that he was told the odometer reading. Now, with the RAV4, you need both a key and a connected battery to be able to read the odometer. It's a digital display. So you need to insert the key into the ignition and turn it at least to accessories or start the car to be able to read the odometer. So there's no other way they could have read the odometer on the 7th of November. Now, when the crime lab had a key is a puzzle, because I think it later comes out it was Wendorf when he went to collect the RAV4 from the crime lab on the 11th. He says that Lucy Meyer, the manager of the crime lab, hands him a key, and he describes it as a key that the crime lab had made to enter the RAV4 when they didn't have a key. So we know that at least from the 7th they had a key. Now, did they have a copy key that was made before Groffey first approached the vehicle on the morning of the 6th of November? I think that's a bit of a stretch, because we're talking about, Ertl says he drops the RAV4 off at about 1 a.m, Sunday morning, and then Groffey appears later, round or before midday on Sunday, and he says that the driver's door is open.
And this is at the State Crime Lab, correct?
Correct, in Madison, allegedly. Now, there's only 3 ways you can reproduce a key for the RAV. You can have one cut, usually by a dealer or a locksmith, based on the VIN, or you can access the code that's written on the lock barrel, which is, I think it's on the passenger side door, but that involves either drilling a hole or dismantling the door and accessing the lock barrel itself. There's a number printed on it which gives you the code to the bidding for the key. And the third option is to copy a key that you've already got. Now, I don't know what dealerships would be open early on a Sunday morning to produce a brand new key based on the VIN for the crime lab in Madison. It's certainly possible, but I know that there was someone on Reddit who asked that question. They put in a FOIA request and asked specifically for a copy of receipts or any information about the fabrication of a key, who made it, when, how much it costs, that sort of thing. And the response was that there was no records responsive to that request. So either the DOJ or the crime lab didn't want to disclose how they had a key, or those records don't exist. So taking that at face value, they didn't have a key made by a dealer based on the VIN. So then you go to the second option. Did they copy the code on the lock barrel? Well, there's no evidence that they took apart the door to access the barrel to read that code. Nobody documents it. There's no photos of the door being pulled apart. So I think you rule that one out as well. That leaves you with, did they copy an existing key? Well, that means that they needed to have a key in their possession in the first place. Now, of course, nobody documented that, and we don't know for sure where that key that was found in Stephen Avery's trailer appeared from. Apparently it appeared on the 8th, and coming back to your original question, there's all those typos about when that key was found. I think there was efforts being made, particularly when Culhane testified that she took that key and inserted it on the 8th, the one that was found in Stephen Avery's trailer, because apparently they sent it straight to the crime lab and she got her hands on it. And she put it in the ignition and turned the ignition. I think there was efforts being made in documents and in testimony to account for key-related activity on the car. Somebody obviously turned a key in the ignition with a connected battery on the 7th, yet Culhane tries to claim that she inserted the 7620 key, the one that was found in Stephen Avery's trailer, into the ignition on the 8th, and the motor didn't start because the battery was disconnected. Well, Culhane was there. She was around that vehicle when it was being processed on the 7th. She would have known that that was when they discovered that the battery was disconnected. That it's documented in Fassbender's report. So I'm not convinced that Culhane is telling the truth when she claims that on the 8th she turned a key and the motor didn't start.
I'm not convinced that Culhane is telling the truth about anything. But I have a question about the keys. So actually I have two questions about that. If they had a key made and they found a different key in Stephen Avery's bedroom, why are there not two keys in evidence?
There's the 7620 key. That's the valet key that was found in his bedroom on the 8th. And then there's also the copy key. And that was the one that was handed to Wendorf on the 11th. The only record we have of where that key came from that I'm aware of is his comment that Lucy Meyer handed him that key and said it was a copy key made when they didn't have a key to access the vehicle.
But I haven't seen any pictures of it. I haven't even seen it on an evidence list. Have I just missed that?
I think you've missed it. It is on evidence lists.
Okay.
It's in the letters.
I think I've seen a picture of it.
There is a picture of it. And
well, dagnabbit, somebody needs to show me that picture because I haven't seen it at all. I was like, why isn't there two?
I think somebody was comparing that key and the valet key on Twitter at some point. I'll see if I can dig that up and put it in the show notes.
My other question was, didn't Link say there's a key? Like, if he said that, if that's the testimony, why do they not all say Link found the key? Is it because they didn't want it to be Link who found it officially because they weren't supposed to be there? Like, did they just say it that way? Like, what's really going on here? Why is that so inconsistent?
I think that there was what really happened, and then there's what we're being told. And I know that sounds obvious, but I think Manitowoc's involvement, I think they were certainly doing a lot more than what Pagel said at the time, which was they were just there to offer assistance and equipment. Or I think he even said they were just there to offer equipment. They were actively leading searches and investigating. And I mean, I've never got into that whole argument of what happened in Stephen's trailer that morning when they found that key. But what I will do is I'll take you back a step. When Lenk and Colburn and Remiker first searched Stephen's trailer on the 5th, the same day that they found the RAV, they found a few keys. There was the 2 keys on a 2003 keyring, which was found in the bookcase in his bedroom. And there was also the 8114 key, which was found in his lounge room on the portable bar. Remiker documents it, and so does Tyson. And they were taking pictures. Now, the next day, Dietering, I think it was interviewing Jody on the 6th. and he had Jacobs with him, I think, from Manitowoc. And they asked Jody specifically, Dietering, he said, I had learned that a key for a foreign vehicle had been found in Stephen Avery's residence. And I asked Jody if Stephen owns any import vehicles. Now she talks about the Grand Am and his big black Ford and the, I think she calls it an Isuzu. She might be referring to the Suzuki. But when you look at all the evidence photos, there's no car key in evidence that was collected on the 5th. Now, the only key it could have possibly been, because you look at the two keys on a 2003 keyring, they look like keys to door locks. The 8114 key, which was found on the portable bar in the living room, the blade of the key, it's got a straight edge and the bitting is only on one side. That's not obviously a car key, and it's certainly not belonging to the Suzuki or the Grand Am. Now, I don't know whether they were just trying to smoke Jody out and get her to say something about a car key or see what she knew, but there was certainly no car key entered into evidence from that search on the 5th. And that, I think, begins the mystery of how and when they had a key in their possession which could have opened and been used on the RAV.
We're talking with Henbury. You can find him on Twitter at Henbury Ave, and I'll put a link in the show notes. So Colhane says she was there on both the 7th and the 8th at the crime lab looking at the RAV?
Yes.
And how much time did she spend there on the 7th? And how much time did she spend there on the 8th? Do you know?
I'm not sure about the 8th. So she did a couple of things on the 7th. She says that she arrived there in the morning and she processed the RAV. And in her pre-trial testimony, I think it was with Johnson, she said that she was busy processing the RAV for most of the day. So, take any usual working day, that's a good number of hours. Now, if you look at the crime lab evidence ledgers of when they received evidence, the RAV, and this is an issue in and of itself, Paul Rush from Calumet apparently submits the RAV to the crime lab at 10:45, I think it was, on the morning of Monday the 7th. Now, just on a tangent for a moment, John Erdl says that he delivered the RAV to the crime lab on the Saturday night or the early hours of Sunday morning, and it's not documented anywhere. And crime lab protocol is that when evidence is submitted to one of the evidence specialists that sits out the front, when evidence is brought in either in person or submitted through the mail or what have you, they document that on the receipts when they receive that evidence. And they say that Paul Rush in person submitted item A, which is the RAV, on the morning of the 7th.
Which is not Sunday.
That's correct. Now, look, it's possible that Erdl did deliver the RAV and it sat there until Groffey and Harrington had a look at it on Sunday the 6th, and they didn't actually clark it in until the morning of the 7th. But Rush was there in person, according to the documents. So did Rush just deliver some paperwork, which is a long drive from Calumet to Madison, just to submit some paperwork? They had fax machines then, and there's plenty of evidence of them using fax machines throughout the investigation. He could have stayed where he was and sent over the paperwork to submit that evidence, but he went over in person. So did he deliver the vehicle himself on the 7th? And that opens up another line of questioning. Where was the vehicle between the 5th and the 7th? Who knows? And what supports that is there's audio of Pagel on the 6th on the Calumet dispatch. I think he was talking to a dispatcher and he was saying I need somebody to escort a vehicle to Madison. And he was looking for anybody. He said it could be, he said it was anybody he had deputised. It could have been a jailer. It could have been any one of his deputies. He just needed somebody to escort the vehicle so that they could say or document that the vehicle had reached Madison. Now, I don't know what he means when he says vehicle. Is he referring to one of their own vehicles escorting evidence, or is he referring to the RAV itself? I don't know. But it's an interesting piece of audio because there was no other evidence submitted to well, the first evidence submitted to the crime lab in Madison wasn't until rush on the morning of the 7th. So what Pagel was asking around for on the 6th, it wasn't in relation to anything else. Nothing else was submitted. So that supports that perhaps it was Rush that actually delivered the vehicle himself on the morning of the 7th. Coming back to Culhane, so she testified, or at least in pre-trial, that she spent most of the day processing the RAV on the 7th. Now, the protocol, again, coming back to the protocol at the crime lab, is when evidence is submitted, they write a receipt, they note the time. It's about 40 minutes after Rush submits the RAV that Culhane submits her samples that she took from the RAV, so the swabbings of blood stains. Now, if you read the testimony and you understand what Culhane was doing, she was doing presumptive tests. She was thoroughly examining the vehicle inside and out, looking for any sort of evidence that she could swab. And then she was air drying her swabs on her little makeshift desk in the garage.
Was she blowing on them?
Yeah. Well, she had bins with her again. If you consider how long that would have taken her, yeah, that could have taken her most of the day to thoroughly process this vehicle. Yet she's submitting into evidence about, I think it's 14 items, about 40 minutes after the vehicle officially arrives or is submitted as evidence to the crime lab. There's not enough time for her to accomplish all of those tasks in the time that she apparently took to submit those items of evidence. So there's something not right with her documentation of when she submitted those samples and the time she claims, or at least it appears that she would have taken to collect those samples. And in my mind, and I've thought about it, I'm concerned that she never actually took those samples herself. She was given them perhaps by those who examined the vehicle the day before.
I can see Julie, so I can see that you have shocked her in some way, and I know she's formulating a question. I have a quick question before that about these blood samples. So Sherry Culhane, is she testifying that she is the one that swabbed all of the blood in the RAV, like Stephen Avery's blood on the ignition, for example?
Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. On the 6th, we know that Harrington and Groffey examined the vehicle, and it's interesting that, yes, it's a missing persons case still at that stage, and everybody's in shock and awe that they didn't open the vehicle at the salvage yard on the 5th, and there's a convenient excuse of the weather. There's a strong argument that it's a missing person. You need to open that car and find out whatever you can about where that person may be. So the whole argument, at least through Ertl's testimony, of moving the vehicle to the crime lab so that it could be processed, that loses its weight when Harrington and Groffey spend not much time at all having a look at it on the 6th. Remembering that it's still a missing persons case, they seem to open some doors, have a little look around, and then they take presumptive swabs of the ignition blood and the blood in the cargo area. Now, they determine that it is blood. Groffey couldn't say whether he knew, when he testified, he couldn't say whether he knew whether it reacts to human blood or animal blood. But those are the tests that they did on the 6th, and we know that they provided a preliminary report to Fassbender on the 6th explaining to him that they found blood on the ignition and in the cargo area, and that there was also either a palm print or a bloody palm print on the rear cargo door. Now, the term preliminary report is mentioned a few times, and I think it was even in media reports the next day as well. I've attempted to obtain a copy of a, in inverted commas, preliminary report by the crime lab dated the 6th of November, and I've been told that it doesn't exist, would respond to a request. So either that was a verbal report that Fassbender received on the 6th, and he does mention that he was in phone contact with the lab that day, so it's plausible that he received a verbal report. But again, a missing persons case, these guys don't spend much time at all looking in the vehicle, and apparently they don't document anything regarding their examination. Now, the next day, Culhane, at least according to her testimony, she repeats the tests, the swabs for presumptive blood. Now, had Groffey and Harrington documented what they did appropriately or communicated with Culhane in some way, at least Groffey was there on both occasions, he could have informed Culhane, I've already swabbed the ignition, I've already swabbed the cargo area in the interests of preserving the amount of specimen remaining. You don't need to repeat those presumptive tests, yet she does. So they risk using up more sample that can't be tested later on. And it's interesting that she would repeat tests that apparently have already been done. It's like she's trying to account again for something that's documented or mentioned that they can't go back and change. And she's like the key in the ignition, she's covering for activity that's happened in the vehicle. Now, she also does then go and swab all of the, apparently all of the visible areas of blood, the CD case, the door frame on the rear passenger side, the ignition, the cargo area. Yet, even though she says in testimony she spent most of the day processing the vehicle, we know that there's only a window of about 40 minutes that it took her to submit her blood swabs into evidence. So she mustn't have actually spent that long with the vehicle, but somehow she manages to miss A23, which is the big bloody hand or palm print on the rear cargo door, and that presents a problem of its own. So when Riddle later examines the RAV, I think it was the next day on the 8th, he sees this big print on the rear cargo area and he says to Culhane, hey, you missed this. And it's almost like she begrudgingly swabs it and enters A23 into evidence as a blood swab, and then Riddle processes and lifts the print. Now, that big bloody print, A23, it's visible in Exhibit 307. That's the photo of the rear cargo door of the RAV when it's sitting in the garage at the crime lab. Now, Groffey's testimony is a little ambiguous. It's difficult to elicit from him exactly when he took that photo, but as was, I think, originally noticed by TikTok Manitowoc himself on the Making a Murderer subreddit, A23 is not visible on the rear cargo area of the RAV in the stern photos. There's no blood that you can see on the rear. And with more copies of higher resolution photos that we've been able to get through Calumet and also the Wisconsin State Patrol, that blood is not there. A23 is not, I'm happy to say that A23 is not present on the RAV whilst that vehicle is sitting at the Avery salvage yard. Now, Fassbender himself, in the Wisconsin State Patrol photos, he's pictured nicely standing right behind the RAV when they're lifting the tarp. And in his testimony, he said that, along with everybody else, nobody saw any blood on or in that vehicle. And Fassbender was right there. He was, maybe 3 or 4 feet away from where that bloody print was found. For him to miss that would be inexcusable as an investigator, because it's right there in front of his face. Now, from that, I've concluded that A23 was not present on the RAV whilst it was sitting at the Avery salvage yard. Therefore, it appears by at least Exhibit 307 whenever Groffey took that photo, but it's been added to the vehicle after it was removed, well, possibly before it was removed from the salvage yard, but I think probably after it was added. Now, if you accept that A23 was added after the vehicle was found by the Sturms, I'm happy to accept that every other piece of blood evidence was added to that vehicle around the same time.
And as Julie likes to point out, it's hard to trust the identification of that blood. That, it's hard to trust that they found Stephen's blood in the front and Teresa's blood in the back.
Yeah, because the swabs that they supposedly swabbed the hood latch with, I firmly believe never touched the hood latch. So if we are to believe that, then it's not that far of a reach to believe that the swabs that were tested, that were used to identify the blood in the RAV as Stephen's, we don't have anything that proves the blood on those swabs came from the RAV. It's all suspect because it's based on reports from people who are lying all over the place about a bunch of other stuff. So I don't know that I believe that the blood in the RAV is even Stephen's. I don't know.
So here's something to consider, and it's something that I've not raised before. I noticed it a while ago, and I've still been trying to develop it. Groffey on the 6th, according to his testimony, he says the driver's door is unlocked and he opens it, and then per his testimony with Buting, he reaches around and opens all the other doors. We know that they're in the cargo area because they swabbed the blood. So how did they get into the cargo area? The cargo door, the rear cargo door, can only be opened with a key because there's a lock, or it gets opened by the central locking. If the battery's disconnected and you turn the key in the driver's door, you're only going to unlock the driver's door. And if the other 3 passenger doors are locked, you can infer that the rear cargo door will also be locked because it relies on central locking the same as those doors. So if the battery's disconnected and they turn a key in the driver's door, that opens the driver's door only. So if the battery's disconnected, how then did they open the rear cargo door with a disconnected battery? They needed a key. They had to have a key. And Groffey does admit when Buting questions him that he did open the cargo door. Unfortunately, I think Buting, perhaps not understanding the intricacies of the locks and the power and that sort of thing, he didn't ask him how he opened the cargo door, and Groffey doesn't explain when the cargo door was opened or how he opened it. But you can infer based on the battery and whether they had a key or not, they needed a key to open that cargo door. So Groffey couldn't have just arrived to find an unlocked driver's door. Groffey himself said that he opened the cargo door. So then that places a key in Groffey's hand, or at least in front of his face, with somebody else using it, if he's telling the truth.
That's very interesting. I was just thinking about Groffey and how he said he reached around and unlocked all the doors. That would mean to get to the passenger door, he would have had to sit down in the driver's seat.
Or reach right across, yeah.
Right. So he would have had to brace himself on the center console in order to do that, right? Did he have gloves on? Don't know. Just a thought. Julie, have you formulated your question? Because
wasn't.
we are going to talk about Ertl and how he got the vehicle out of where it was.
I
And Stacy told me not to ask you any questions about the bolts. So
Stacey Seabrook,
yes,
what does
he
he
said,
want to know about?
he said, don't ask, he said, you want to drive him crazy? Don't ask him any questions about the bolts at all.
If you want to drive me crazy, tell me there was two RAVs.
Yeah,
no, I don't think you'll
you're
hear
not going to
that
get
from
that from
us.
us. Yeah. Okay, so back to what
So
we were saying. Julie, have you formulated your question?
my question, what I wanted to say actually has nothing to do with my complete shock at what he was saying. I that is the very first time I've heard that Poggle was on the 6th asking around for somebody to escort a vehicle. Like I didn't know that. And that is very interesting.
I didn't know
Um,
that either, if that helps any.
oh, well, good. I'm glad it's not just me. Um, so what I was going to say is, Henbury, you said that they wrote reports saying that there was blood on the ignition and there was blood in the cargo area on the 7th, right?
There was a preliminary report that was given to Fassbender on the 6th
Oh, on the
after
6th.
by Harrington and Groffey, and that they had found blood, on the ignition in the rear cargo area.
Okay, the reason why I ask is because Mike Hallbach did an interview, and there was an article that was posted where he was talking to this reporter on the 8th. And it was published on the 8th, but it was after the 7th because he said the volunteer searchers didn't find anything new on Monday and they planned to do more searching today. Then he says, no news right now is good news. They didn't find evidence of harmful acts. It's good news for us. So at that point, the Hallbach family had been told that they hadn't found anything. So I don't understand how they have a report as of the 6th saying they found blood, and Teresa's brother is saying they didn't find any evidence of harmful acts. I would think that her family would be like, yeah, they're investigating stuff and we're still hopeful. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know why he would confirm, like he makes it sound like a confirmation. They didn't find anything. It just strikes me as odd.
Yeah, that's right. And so I've looked at the media reports around that time, and if you assume that most reports are talking about events that happened the day before, because a lot of it's newspaper, I don't know, and I'm vaguely remembering the what you're talking about with Mike Holbach. I don't know whether he's just holding out hope or whether he's just plainly not been told. But it's even in Fassbender's criminal complaint that they filed. He talks about Harrington and Groffey, or at least Harrington, that he received a preliminary report from Harrington on the 6th saying that there was blood. And if I'm remembering correctly, media reports, I think, were saying on the 7th, or at least in press conferences or whatever, they were saying, yeah, we found blood, referencing the 6th. And now I can't remember whether it's a press conference or a quote in text or not, but there is a quote from Kratz saying that they knew or they had found blood on the 5th. Now, I don't know whether that's a Freudian slip or it's just another typo, but it would not surprise me if they knew or they had already planned to find blood in that vehicle on the 5th.
That's true. And it's just the inconsistency is what gets me. I mean, it's possible they didn't tell the Hallbach family, and I don't know if they were avoiding watching media, so they wouldn't have known about it. It's also possible that, I mean, this article was published on the 8th, and it was clearly because it appears to have been written after the 7th. But that doesn't mean that particular quote wasn't said before that. Reporters
Yeah,
all the time, they write a story and they put stuff to make it seem like things were said at the same time, and they might not necessarily have been said that way or in that context. So that's also possible. It's just something that I noticed, and people probably other people have probably noticed, and the inconsistency is curious.
Was it Mike that said something about the activities on Monday, or was it the reporter that put it in the story?
It's not a quote, but it
Okay.
says, he said the volunteer searchers didn't find anything new on Monday and they planned to do more searching today. No news right now is good news, he said. They didn't find evidence of harmful acts. It's good news for us. So he said, meaning Mike, but it's not a quote. It's paraphrased.
So it's made to sound like he said that at the same time, but he may not
Right.
have.
He may not have. That was the other thing I was going to say. A lot of times when law enforcement will be doing an interview of someone, they will ask the question, so when did this happen? And the person they're interviewing will say, I think it was Tuesday. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Tuesday. And then when the officer writes up their report says, so-and-so told me this happened on Tuesday, September 17th. When they were speaking to them, they were saying, I think it was on Tuesday, but it could have been Wednesday. But the officer wants to put something specific, and so that's not the way the conversation went. And that happens a lot. I found that when I was transcribing police interviews with people, you would see the report that goes with it, and it's not a verbatim report of how the interview went. And so a lot of times when you're reading these, you'll see specific dates, but because we don't have audio of those, we don't know if they actually said this was on the 7th or this was on the 8th. Like we don't exactly know that. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You don't want to, it's like Henbury was saying, if you get hung up on one little thing like that, in some cases, it can just stop you from being able to move on and look at actual inconsistencies. It depends on what it is, though. I don't want to minimize that because there are things that,
Nobody's perfect. Mistakes get made. Typos happen. People misremember things. But I think what really hurts them with these dates that you're talking about, Fen, is Pagel's affidavit is dated November 9th, and he's saying that the key was found by Kaczarski on the 7th, and it successfully was used in the ignition of the RAV4 and the key started the vehicle. We're only talking about 2 days there. So Pagel's contemporary record dated November 9th should be fresh in his mind. It should be very accurate if he's only talking about something that happened within the last 2 days. And I think that's what really hurt them, as far as if there was anything sinister going on with the crime lab having a key that they shouldn't have had, or they somehow accessed the vehicle in a manner that they shouldn't have. The earliest report of a key being used is Pagel's affidavit. And so I think that's why Culhane then came along in her testimony and said, well, all these key-related activities involving the RAV that happened at the crime lab, it was on the 8th after I got delivered the key. I was doing those things. I turned the key, the battery wasn't connected, that sort of thing. They had a very short window where they could try and account for a key, and I think that's why Culhane falls on the 8th when that key came through from Stephen's trailer.
So we're speaking with Henbury. He is Henbury Ave on Twitter, and you can find him on Reddit under Henbury, which makes sense, right? So who is Ertl?
John Ertl is he's a scientist. He's a DNA analyst with the crime lab, and he, along with everybody else, is on the roster for field response. And he was contacted on the Saturday the 5th of November when the RAV was located on the salvage yard. He was on call, and he was asked to respond to the salvage yard in his capacity as field response to retrieve the RAV4, which is an interesting proposition because in his testimony, he recalls that Dave Remiker from Manitowoc called him and said, "Can you come and take this vehicle away?" He wasn't asked to attend the scene and process evidence and look at the vehicle. He was asked to come and collect the vehicle, which I think insightful.
And they called him around noonish. Do we know what time they called him?
It was soon after they found the RAV.
So that was about 10:30 in the morning.
Yep.
And he didn't get there until late afternoon?
Wasn't until like 4, I think, because he had to drive from Madison. What's interesting about him being called is Remiker, through Manitowoc Dispatch, asks for the Madison Crime Lab specifically. I think there were other Wisconsin State Crime Labs closer to the salvage yard that could have responded, but Remiker specifically asks for the team out of Madison, and he also does it just before the scene is reportedly handed over to Calumet. Now, Pagel actually documents that he contacted someone at the Department of Justice and requested that they get the crime lab to attend as well. I don't know whether he knew that Remiker had already made that call and arranged for someone from Madison to attend. Again, I think that's insightful.
So between the time the RAV was found and the time he arrived, what do you think happened during that time? I know they placed a tarp on it and took a tarp off. Apparently, they didn't move any of the debris and other items that were on the RAV before he got there, because he stated that as soon as he arrived, that's when they started looking in the windows with flashlights, and that was their first opportunity that anyone had gotten to look inside. That's what he stated.
I call bull. Just saying.
He said that this was the first time anyone had been able to get close enough to the RAV to look inside. And he also stated that all the doors were locked, just for the record. So what do you think happened during the time? Have you thought about what may have happened to the RAV during that time? Just seems like an awfully long time for them to be standing around not looking for Teresa.
That's right. So I think you've got some of them went to obtain a search warrant, and that took a few hours. We've only really got the scene logs to rely on as far as who approached the vehicle and what they were doing. I think it was just before Ertl got there that Fassbender and a few others came to take the tarp off, and Ertl said that as he got there, they were taking the tarp off. There's speculation that there was some funny business going on under the tarp when it wasn't raining. So why did they put the tarp there? I don't know. I haven't really speculated too much about what happened in that time because, to be honest, there's no information.
No information, yeah. What I really want to talk about is how they got the RAV out of there, because it was up against a little sapling, right? There was a car right next to it. It was a pretty tight space, and it was also next to a pretty steep embankment. So how did they get this car out of there, Henbury?
So if you look at the photos and the State Patrol diagrams, where the vehicle was sitting, there was a track next to it, and there was perhaps room for one vehicle to get through there. And then there was another vehicle opposite it, and that was right next to the embankment that went down to the pond. And immediately in front of the RAV, there is a large tree trunk, but that was apparently placed there. That could be moved. But there are some saplings that are rooted in the ground immediately in front of it, and they would present an obstacle to retrieving the vehicle. And along with the vehicle immediately opposite and the embankment, I think it's really not possible to move the RAV from its front. There's too many obstacles and the angles just don't work. So if you come to Ertl's testimony, he said that when the wrecker finally arrived, it was a guy called Paul Rabbis. He had the tow truck, and a guy called Nick Mersberger from Pethin, I think they were out of Calumet, had brought the covered trailer that they were going to remove the RAV from the salvage yard in, and they wanted to protect the RAV in a covered trailer so that they could preserve the evidence that was presumably on the RAV, like non-existent bloody handprints on the rear cargo door. But that aside, Ertl says that the tow truck, or Rabbis, reversed along the dirt road or the track along the around the pond, and he reversed his tow truck to the rear of the RAV4. Now, Ertl then, in his testimony, he goes on to explain in great detail that Rabbis, he says straight off the bat, he wanted to shift the RAV or get it into neutral so that the wheels could roll, so that he could pull it out of there. So that was obviously his intention, to put the vehicle into neutral. But because all the doors were locked, he couldn't get in, he couldn't do that. So he then crawled under to try and reach the linkage. He couldn't do that. Then he wanted to pop the hood and try something else, but the doors were locked. He couldn't do that. So what Ertl describes is that Rabbis then crawled under the RAV and unbolted front drive shaft in order to unlock both front wheels, which is plausible in any four-wheel drive vehicle, and Ertl says that as fact. He says the RAV is a four-wheel drive, and the wrecker then lifted the rear wheels and he towed the RAV, rolling it on its front wheels, and he took it back around to the flat area where the crusher was, and he then loaded the RAV into the covered trailer. And Fassbender describes it as, because he was there as a witness, and when he testified, Fassbender said the wrecker, he backed the RAV4 into the covered trailer. So that's all presumably one fluid movement. Ertl doesn't describe any intermediate steps. He doesn't describe any changing of directions or driving back around the pond and picking it up from the front. He's very meticulous and deliberate in what he says. And then Ertl says that they then took the RAV away in the covered trailer and they drove straight to Madison. They took longer than expected because the trailer wasn't pulling correctly. So he establishes that it took them longer to get to Madison than what it should have. And then when they arrived at the crime lab, Ertl says that he called a local wrecker to come and do the opposite of what Rabbis had done at the salvage yard, and that was to lift the rear wheels of the RAV, because it's been inserted nose first into the trailer, lift up the rear wheels and pull the RAV out of the trailer, rolling it on its front wheels, and place it in the garage. And he says in the Stephen Avery trial and also the Brendan Dassey trial, I think it's more specifically the Dassey trial, he says that the rear drive shaft was still attached and that the rear wheels were locked. That's the narrative that Ertl very meticulously and deliberately provides when he testified. Now, when I got interested in reading the case, I immediately recognised that Ertl says that the RAV4 has a front drive shaft that unlocks both front wheels. The problem is 99 Toyota RAV4 is an all-wheel drive vehicle. It doesn't have a front drive shaft as contemplated by his testimony or in any mechanical sense. It's an all-wheel drive vehicle. It's got a transaxle with a couple of half shafts that run to each front wheel. Now, that's important because not only is Ertl describing the unbolting of a piece of the car that doesn't exist, but it removes the credibility of his story of, well, how did they actually get the RAV out of there? Now, coming back to what I said about where it was sitting, I think it was only possible to pull the RAV from its rear or lift up the rear wheels and tow it around to the flat area. So they had to unlock the front wheels somehow. And we know that they did because in the photos of the RAV, when it's sitting at the garage at the crime lab, which Groffey testified he took on the next day on the 6th, the tyre valve stems on the front wheels are in different positions. So they're a reliable marker of like a minute hand on a clock. You can see that they've moved, so the rear wheels have definitely rolled to some extent. And consistent with where the RAV was sitting, they had to unlock those front wheels somehow to tow that vehicle around to the flat area. Now, there's only a couple of ways they could have achieved that, and that is to either lift or jack up the RAV and go to a great deal of trouble at the expense of time and remove both front wheels and remove both front half shafts and then replace both front wheels and lower the vehicle back down. That unlocks the front wheels from the transmission and will allow them to roll. But Rabbers, the wrecker, was not with the vehicle long enough to achieve that. That takes at least a few hours to do that. So the only other way they could have unlocked those front wheels is to open a door and shift the transmission out of park and most likely into neutral. And you can do that. There's a shift release button on the transmission. You don't need a key to do that. You can just get a screwdriver and push that button on the transmission, and you can then shift it into neutral. And that is the only explanation that fits the evidence between the photos of the RAV at the salvage yard and the crime lab. So not only is Ertl describing something that's not, it's not only not plausible, it just couldn't happen. A front drive shaft doesn't exist. What he's, I think, hiding is that they did open a door to the RAV whilst it was sitting at the salvage yard. And I've had discussions with people about, well, is that really relevant? What does that mean? And the argument that I've put forward is that in pre-trial, when Avery, through Buting and Strang, put forward his theory about planting of blood evidence, the prosecution replied to that and said that in Avery's submission, the defence was unable to establish how there was any opportunity to plant blood in the RAV because the RAV was always locked. Nobody ever opened it until it got to the crime lab. And I think had Ertl properly documented how the RAV was moved, and he did write a report, I think it was dated the 23rd of November or December, he describes what happened on the 5th, but he does not go into any detail about how the RAV was moved. He certainly doesn't say that a door was opened. Had the defence known that a door was opened whilst the vehicle was sitting at the salvage yard, that opens the opportunity for them to argue that, well, yes, blood could have been planted. I think the state took that away from them, and that could have changed the course of the pre-trial motions, because had the defence known that, had they been able to argue that, I think it would have gone another way.
So just to clarify something, you're saying that the valve stems for the front and the rear wheels were in different positions. Is that correct?
From the stern photos at the salvage yard on the 5th to the Groffy photos that he said he took on the 6th, the tyre valve stems on both the front and the rear wheels are in different positions, which would suggest that all of those wheels have rolled. And the interesting part, and this only came to my attention not too long ago, was I'd suspected for a long time that the bolts that existed in evidence, we knew for a long time that they were on an evidence list. We knew that there was drive shaft bolts separated from the vehicle and they were in evidence. I suspected for a long time that they were actually from the rear drive shaft because that was the only place they could have come from. And then when the Calumet case file photos came out, the picture of the drive shaft bolts confirmed that the only place they could have come from was the join between the rear drive shaft and the rear differential. There's no front drive shaft. There's no bolts on a front drive shaft. And when I looked back at Exhibit 289, the photo of the RAV sitting in the garage at the crime lab that Groffy says he took on the 6th of November, not only was that vehicle facing the wrong way as to how Ertl said it got there, the photos that are available on the Stephen Avery case website, I think they're scans of court photos. and they're not very clear. I spent a long time looking at those photos and trying to clear them up and see anything I could. The copy of that photo that's in Making a Murderer, I'd taken a screenshot of it, and when I turned up the brightness, you can actually see in that photo that the rear drive shaft is hanging from the vehicle. It's already been unbolted. So you've got rear drive shaft bolts in evidence. You've got a rear drive shaft hanging from the vehicle, which is facing the wrong way in the garage. And you've got Ertl saying the rear drive shaft was still attached and the rear wheels were locked when that vehicle was put in the garage. That is not consistent. And then add to it, as you say, those tyre valve stems are all in different positions. The unbolted rear drive shaft can account for the rolling of the rear wheels, but that has no effect whatsoever on rolling of the front wheels. And so you still come back to how did the front wheels roll? And the only real explanation that's explained by the evidence is that the door was opened and the transmission was shifted into neutral.
So if they had the ability to shift the transition into neutral, why did they bother undoing the rear drive shaft? Was it just for appearances because they had said that they had unbolted the drive shaft? Then they felt like they had to unbolt the drive shaft?
So that was also something I'd thought about for a long time, and I didn't have any evidence to really support it. And it wasn't until those photos came out and then turning up the brightness on 289 that you could see that rear drive shaft hanging. I asked myself, why was it such a big deal that they couldn't admit that the rear drive shaft was unbolted? Now, from where the RAV was sitting at the salvage yard to moving it to the crime lab, it was not necessary to ever unbolt that rear drive shaft. If they just opened the door, unlocked the front wheels by shifting the transmission and towed it around to the flat area and put it in nose first into the trailer, there was no need to unlock the rear drive shaft to achieve that. And then in the opposite direction, when they got to the garage, they didn't need to unbolt the rear drive shaft at any stage to put it back in the garage. So I had to ask myself, how and when did that rear drive shaft get unbolted and for what purpose? Now, it's plausible to consider that that rear drive shaft was unbolted at some stage to facilitate towing the vehicle. But if it wasn't necessary to do it between the salvage yard and the crime lab, when did it happen? And the light bulb moment was it unbolted before anybody found the vehicle at the salvage yard on the 5th? You know, Teresa Holbach would not have driven around with a unbolted rear drive shaft. The conclusion that I reached was that it's potentially pointing to the rear drive shaft being unbolted to facilitate towing the vehicle at some stage before the 5th of November. And to me, that fits in with if somebody found the vehicle and they couldn't get into it because they didn't have a key, the battery was dead or disconnected, or the vehicle was immobilised somehow, and they wanted to move it quick, it's plausible to unbolt that rear drive shaft with the assistance of a wrecker and tow it somewhere. Strongly points towards planting of the vehicle, as in it was not found, or the vehicle was not on the salvage yard between October 31 and November 5.
Just a reminder that we're speaking with Henbury today. You can find him on TikTok, Manitowoc, on Reddit under Henbury. So last February, KZ did an Ask Zellner Q&A on Twitter, and I tweeted to her that I had heard a rumor that the RAV4 had been lost, destroyed, or returned to the haul box. So, and I asked her, is there any truth to this rumor that you're aware of? And she tweeted, untrue. It's in the possession of the CCSO. She seems pretty confident that Calumet County Sheriff's Office has possession of the RAV4. Do you know where the RAV is now?
I know it's not where Calumet evidence ledgers say it is. I've followed the RAV through the ledgers, and the movements of the vehicle are, when Wendorf collected it from the crime lab on the 11th of November, I think it was, they moved it to a storage unit in Chiltern and it was there for a little while, and then they moved it into a blue storage container in the car park of the Calumet Sheriff's Office. And that's where you see the photos, the Wisconsin State Patrol photos of the RAV being pulled out, and they examine it. You can arguably see that blue container in the car park on satellite images around that time. Now, according to the Calumet evidence ledgers, you can see keys coming and going when they want to access the padlocks to open that storage unit. They don't always document it, sometimes they don't. And you also see movement of the 7620 key, which is the valet key that was found in Avery's trailer, which they used one day to apparently connect the battery and start the RAV to check that the key fit the ignition. The ledgers, as they stand, suggest that the vehicle is still sitting in the blue container in the Calumet car park, because there's certainly no reports that the blue container or the RAV were moved, and there's no further entries in the ledgers to suggest that keys were taken or the RAV itself was moved or put in somebody else's custody. The problem is the satellite images show that that blue container is no longer in the car park. So that means that the RAV, well, at least the blue container has moved, and presumably the RAV inside it has as well. So according to the ledgers, the RAV is no longer where it should be, and that raises the question, where is it? The Calumet Highway Department was rebuilt, I can't remember when exactly, but one of the purposes for rebuilding it was so that Calumet Sheriff had an area to store evidence and process vehicles. And an argument could be made that, well, the RAV presumably got moved to the new Calumet Highway Department for storage, but we don't know. The ledgers don't tell us that. As for Kathleen Zellner, I don't know what information she's relying on. I would assume that she's been told by somebody who should know where the vehicle is, or somebody has cited it personally and informed her, or she may have even cited it herself, I don't know. You're right, she is confident that it's still in Calumet custody, but she was assured that they had the bones too. And that was both the prosecutors who were still around and Calumet that told her that they still had the bones, that they didn't have them. So whether she has been led down the garden path and the RAV is gone, I don't know.
It's also possible that she said that, waiting for somebody to correct her and say, no, actually, we don't have it. And the fact that they didn't is something that could be brought up later. Well, I mentioned it and they didn't correct me. They didn't say that they didn't have it. So that is an implication that they did have it.
I saw Jerry Buting recently said something about the RAV and how they were very specific about how that RAV needed to be preserved. So he is confident that they still have it.
Yeah.
The statutes should have protected the bones too, but they handed those off.
Indeed, yeah.
I don't mean to presume anything, but it was interesting a couple of years ago when the access to the RAV was being discussed, and it seemed right up until the point that Kathleen Zellner nearly got access to it, that was when Sukowitz suddenly stopped that process. And I wouldn't put it past them that the RAV is either not in the condition it should be, but also that it's not in their possession anymore.
I hope that's not the case.
I hope so too. I feel so concerned because, like, giving away the bones, right? They can say, oops, my bad, but now there are no bones to test. So there's nothing to prove them wrong. So if the RAV is gone, oops, my bad, but now there's no way for Kathleen to test the blood that's actually in it.
That's right. She can't go back to the source if the RAV's gone and test that blood. She's left with the blood swabs in evidence that Culhane took that took her all day, but she submitted into evidence within about 40 minutes. She shouldn't rely on those swabs.
Yeah.
And I think that's why she go back to the source.
Speaking of the swabs, did any result ever come of that handprint, the bloody handprint? Whose blood was that?
I believe that it was male, but it was not Stephen Avery, but they couldn't get a full profile or something.
All that blood and they couldn't get a profile? That was probably the largest blood deposit on the RAV. I guess you could argue that there was more blood in the cargo area, but it was a significant amount of blood for testing.
Exactly, and yet with the 7620 key that was found in the valet key that was found in Avery's trailer, with no trace evidence to Culhane's eye, she was able to develop a DNA profile of Stephen Avery that was greater than what should have been there had he just handled the key. So either she's really incompetent at testing A23, or there's some discrepancies there that need explaining.
Or she's a liar, pants on fire.
You said it.
Or all of the above.
Yes.
So, Henbury, thanks for joining us today. There's so much more to talk about. In addition to the Know Your RAV series, you have another series called Know Your Ravidence, and at least one post on Know Your FOIA requests that I've seen. Are there any hints on what you might be working on next?
Brady.
Ooh.
Woo-hoo.
Well, I'm really looking forward to that.
Ravidence is on the back burner for the time being. I've been distracted with another project, shall we call it, and I'm hoping to have it finished really soon. I think you're all going to like it.
So everybody needs to stay tuned for Henbury episode 2.
Yeah, we're going to have another episode.
Coming up at a later time, yet to be scheduled.
Yeah, I don't think we even had enough time to talk about everything we wanted to talk about this subject, so there are lots more. So that'll wrap it up for this episode of 80 More Things. If you have a topic that you want us to cover, or if you'd like to be a guest on a future episode of this podcast, visit our website at 80morethings.com and let us know what you would like to talk about. While you're there, check out some of the links I've posted for the Center on Wrongful Convictions of Youth, the Innocence Project, workwithkz.com, and bringbrendanhome.org. There is still a petition to pass the Brendan Dassey Juvenile Interrogation and Protection Law, which is really important. There are also lots of links to more information on this case. Don't forget to check out Stacy Seabrook on YouTube. Come get involved and let's see if we can find some actual justice for Teresa. Thanks again for joining us today, Henbury.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Until next time, take care. Bye.
Yay. Bye.
Bye.
Let's keep talking about Avery.